Hello, my friends of the Psychedelic Renaissance. It's Tom Hatsis, your psychedelic historian, and this is part two of my conversation with author Ed Dodge.
Can you see this?
Yes, I can.
Do you know what it is?
I do not.
It's a Hindu lingam and yoni. So this is Shiva and Shakti. Are you familiar with Hinduism?
Not very much at all.
We got,
Although my
we got,
cat's name is Shakti, but
we
besides
got
that.
all right, well, there you go. This is Shakti right here.
Oh, cool.
So we got Kali behind us here. So for Hinduism, mind and matter. So Shiva, immaterial. Mother is the material world, and God the Father is immaterial. You can't, regardless of whether you believe in God or not, we can all agree on definitionally, God is immaterial. You can't touch God, can't see God, can't
Sure.
wrap your arms around God.
Unless
But the
5-MeO
mother is
DMT, then you can. But okay.
right. Well, mother is the material world. Mother and matter actually have the same root. It's the same word. And so this represents, male and female, Shiva and Shakti, mind and matter. And these are sometimes done up as a dildo or as like a, explicitly penis. You know, Hindus sometimes get, depending on your perspective, something get like sensitive about this being phallic object or not, but it totally is. Um, and and these things go way back. I'm not sure. These are Bronze Age. This is another thing about this. The Lingam Yoni is that it's arguably the single oldest object, like religious icon that's in continuous use. Like
Oh,
these things
wow.
have been around since the Bronze Age anyway, maybe older, maybe Indus Valley. I don't even know. They're really, really old. And so that's phallic. And yeah, I don't know. I think it's a good question. How far back? When do they actually, do you have a sense of when they find these carvings of stone penises?
I mean, I know in classical Greece they had them. At least
For
that's a
sure.
pretty.
Dionysus, for sure.
What's yeah, absolutely, yeah, exactly. Before that, I don't know. I haven't looked too deep into the history of dildos. So I probably
Yeah.
should.
So when Alexander the Great went to India and met the Shivites and said, "Oh, you guys are worshiping Dionysus," he was seeing these things. He
Huh.
was seeing these things in India.
Interesting. Very cool. Very
And
cool.
then you get a bronze. There's a bronze serpent that goes with it too.
Oh, that's awesome. Oh, I
So
need
this is the
one.
same bronze serpent that Hezekiah is smashing in the Old Testament when they're having the divorce of the mother goddess.
Yeah, that's cool. So do you like have any relationship with a goddess today, or you like because I'm pretty woo woo. I'm just gonna come right out and say it. I do. I'm curious for you if it's like a historical thing, a almost a social commentary sort of thing, because one could easily make the argument that the return of the goddess again, and whether someone doesn't believe in this kind of stuff or not, it's still good to have that spiritual balance and not completely erase the divine feminine. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are. Please.
So I am not a devotee of any old religion, but I am very influenced by the Hindus for sure. So Shakti is a big part of Hindu traditions, and what I've come to realize is that in the West we have this argument: is there God or is there no God? The God, argue between the Christians and the atheists is like one or zero, one God or zero gods. What the Hindus say, and I think they're correct, is it's not one or zero, it's one and zero, and that the mother is the material world. And so you see this symbolism of the triple goddess repeats over and over and over again all throughout history. It goes back to ancient Egypt, but there's a triple goddess in the Old Testament: Asherah, Astarte, and Anat. It's
Hmm.
in the Quran: Alat, Uzzah, Manat. It's in the Eleusinian Mysteries, where it's Demeter, Persephone, and Hecate is the death goddess. It goes on and on. And then modern day Hinduism, it's Parvati, Durga, and Kali. Kali is the death goddess. So mother, maiden, death. But they're all linked together and they're all part of the same, they're all one goddess. It's all just different aspects of the same goddess, which the Hindus call Shakti. And that's the whole of the material world. So God, the Father, is the mind who wants to put the material world in order, but the mother is the material world. And so as God is shaping the clay, he can only shape the clay where the clay is willing and capable of going. Like he does, God's not, basically I believe in God, but I don't believe his God is unlimited and omnipotent the way the Christians describe it.
Yeah, yeah.
I believe in a God of limited powers. So like what they call panpsychism. The idea is that consciousness and matter are coexistent and eternal. and that consciousness is not something that's just stuck inside your brain, arising from our brain tissue. What we're experiencing in our head is us like tuning in the divine and
Yeah,
then
that's what
having
I've done.
some signal processing that gives us this experience of self-awareness. It's a radio and a computer
Yeah.
tied together.
Mhm.
And this is what the Hindus have been saying for thousands of years. It's mind and matter together. And this is why the Hindu gods are always presented in pairs of male and female pairs, because the male is immaterial, and so he can't act without his Shakti, without his goddess, because she is like actually how that manifests in tangible reality. So mind and matter work together. And this is my worldview. So like I think like this describes my worldview. Mind and matter working together. I believe in God, but it's a limited God, and still obviously very powerful, but not unlimited and omnipotent. The Christians will say God is unlimited and omnipotent, and then the critics will say, well, then why did he create a world full of suffering and evil and death?
Yeah. I
Because he's not unlimited and omnipotent. You
yeah.
know?
As I've said, and you know, I'm a religious pluralist, so I have friends across the religious spectrum. And the one thing that I do, you know, sort of in a friendly way, challenge my Christian friends to consider. It's like, well, if you're saying like, there's no way that God can be omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent all at the same time. Because if God were those three things, we would have radically different results. So
Totally.
God, so for me, and just with my own sort of religion that I've created around downloads from drinking ayahuasca, doing 5-MeO DMT, cannabis also is a phenomenal entheogenic plant. It sort of gets the short shrift sometimes, but I think it's a highly, I mean, it's one of the oldest and actually one of the best. But yeah, it's like,
Speaks to me.
was that?
I said cannabis speaks to me.
Yeah, I love cannabis. I think it's one of the best ones. But yeah, what the thing is, it's like, look, like for me, God is both omnibenevolent and omnipotent. However, it isn't omniscient. In fact, God is not omniscient at all. God is like the ocean. It doesn't like if you go swimming in the ocean has no idea that you're there. The
Right.
ocean produces life. All of life stems from the ocean. Ocean has no idea that all of life comes from it. So for me, God is like the ocean. It is benevolent and powerful. I guess the ocean isn't exactly benevolent, but it's certainly powerful, but it's not cognizant. Like for me, it's like, I don't believe, not only does God not know that we're here, God doesn't know that it is there. And that is sort of how I make sense of the results that we see today. And then the goddess, for me, that's a whole other thing that sprung forth from this god in sort of a classical Gnostic sense, like springing forth from the pleroma, like Sophia and all the other aeons. I have a sort of that ancient Gnostic understanding of the universe as well. Or at least that's the mythopoetry that I put forth for it. Because look, whether the atheist postmodernists like it or not, we evolved to seek these kinds of transcendent experiences. We just, whether they're real or not, we as a species evolved to seek them out. So I say, have fun with it. I say, go for it. Make up your own religion, follow it to a T, make sure that you're not harming anyone, and live a happy life. Or don't, and still live a happy life, you know?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff there. I mean, I generally agree with you. I think that they talk about the high. They talk another repeating motif is the Father and the Son. So the high God. So Christians have got the God and Jesus, but this is a repeating motif. It's not original to Christianity. And I'm with you. Like the high God, the source God, he's way out there, man. Like he is out forming the cosmos and forming black holes and dealing with creating the big stuff. And he's not. We're like insignificant gnats.
Yeah.
That source God, the high God, is not paying attention to you and me, which is why he's got so many sons. That's the Lord of our world is one of his many many sons. This is Hindu. The Hindus talk about it in a similar manner. Um, so you got this father son or maybe grandfather father son, like this repeating motif because the source God, he's way out there, man. He ain't paying attention to us. But there's
Yeah.
other like there's more emanations that are closer to us that are more relatable. And as far as the psychedelics go, I believe in Gaia consciousness. I believe in what Terence McKenna talks about.
Me too.
I believe there's all sorts of collective consciousnesses among people, but I believe that all life is conscious. The vegetation life is conscious. So Mother Earth, Mother Nature, Gaia is very much a thing. In my worldview, we are microorganisms in a larger macroorganism. And we are very much, just as we've got thousands and even millions of microorganisms inside of us, inside of every cell, we've got little bacteria and stuff fighting it out and eating each other and trying to escape and trying to make babies and being like they're having their living out their little dramas, millions of little critters inside of every one of us. I think we are a little critter inside of a bigger critter called Mother Earth. And that the psychedelics is this pathway, this is totally Terence McKenna, to for the Mother Earth to talk to us, like how we can communicate literally with Gaia consciousness is
Yes.
through these psychedelics.
Yeah.
And then it opens a pathway if we just listen to what she's saying.
100%, man. That is exactly where I'm at with all of this. It's just I did a few months ago, I did an interview with a pretty high profile atheist. I'm not going to get into who it is or what, anything like that right now because the interview won't come out for a few months. But one of the things that I found so interesting about, and this guy's like literally like written a book on atheism and all this stuff. And what I found so fascinating was almost every single one of his arguments rested in a presupposition.
Right.
And, it's like, if you're like, so one of the things I'll just, as an example, he had, I talked about, like with 5-MeO DMT, like I was surprised because when I do 5-MeO DMT or before I had ever done it, I thought that God, whatever that is, was going to be this super consciousness, this super intellect. But it wasn't. It was this super feeling of love. It was like the foundation of what all love is. And so he had mentioned like, oh, well, if there is a God, we can't know it through a feeling. And he sort of just said it as this sort of, one-off comment. And I was like, whoa, hold on a second. Why? Like, you're a scientist. What scientific principle or metric did you just invoke to determine that we cannot experience God through a feeling? He had no idea because he's so used to being in atheist circles and just saying things like that. And everybody, oh, yes, of course, it can't be from. Well, through like, what scientific premise are you using to determine that? Well, nothing. It's just a presupposition, and it's like, I find that the atheist arguments against the goddess or the god, like they're no better than arguments in favor of atheism. Like I'm reading a book right now called Atheist Universe, and I mean it's got some pretty cool tidbits in it, but the author, is just lost when it comes to basic understandings about religious history. Like this guy thinks that like the church was burning witches for 1,500 years. It's like, no, dude, it was like 2.5 centuries. Like you're off by, I don't know, like 1,300 years. Like, now, of course, that's 2.5 centuries too long, no doubt about it. But it's like and he said, like, he was talking about how they burned like 10,000 witches every year. It's like, no, they didn't. Like, that's not even like the total number that historians have brought it down to is about 40,000 people actually burned for witchcraft. Again, 40,000 too many. And that's even a higher number because that number is accounting for records lost or cases we don't know about. The real number that we actually have evidence for is actually closer to 32,000. So it's like one of the interesting things about atheists is that they believe that since they're all so scientific, they have this upper hand where they don't actually have to explain the presuppositions on which they rest all of their arguments. And I'm here to say that they do.
I agree with you. I don't find atheist arguments very strong either. And their biggest, where I see the biggest fails for the atheists is the claim that is the materialism. The claim that the material world is all that matters, and that everything that is true can be reduced to math and physics. Well, where did the math and physics come from? Where did the so-called laws of nature come from in the first place? And lots of things can't be reduced to math and physics. Ideas cannot be reduced to math and physics. except ideas clearly have an impact on the material world.
Yes.
Um, they can't resolve consciousness. They can't resolve quantum mechanics. They can't resolve ideas. There's lots of things that can't be resolved by materialist analysis,
Yeah,
and
they
yet they
can't resolve
insist
love
that
either.
that's the only source of truth.
Yeah.
Um, and this is where I think, I truly believe, along with the postmodernism, is that in the West today, especially in America and higher ed, the most educated people are the most wrong right now in
Oh,
America.
no doubt. That's, I mean, is that a question? Like,
Like
I'm
it's such a crisis. It's such a
yeah,
crisis in the Ivy League right now. It's they're really
like,
like headed for the rocks of credibility. Like they're like the Titanic. Like they're full steam ahead right into the field of icebergs. They're so arrogant and so conceited that they are the most educated people. And part of it is also a linear view of history that
oh,
says
yeah.
that everything before now was cold, nasty, brutish, and short, and people have just been getting smarter, smarter, smarter. And we went from many gods, it was ignorant, to one god, and now we're going to trump that by going to zero gods. And we'll show you how smart we are. We're the smartest people that have ever lived in all of human history. And man, they are like the Titanic. They are so full steam ahead, right into the icebergs, man. They're going to end up on the bottom of the sea.
Yeah.
And then I think we're going to end up with like we're due for a reformation, like a big spiritual revival.
Oh, it's coming.
I don't think it's in this generation per se, like not like today, but in the coming years or in the later in this century, like we're due for a big spiritual revival. And I think the
It's coming.
psychedelics can be a part of it.
It,
Mother
it's,
Goddess can be a part of it.
Ed, you're 100% correct about all of that, in my opinion. The only thing I'd say is that, yes, it is coming with this generation. It is
All right.
100% coming with this generation. It is absolutely going to include psychedelics because I mean, that direct experience of the divine leaves no room for doubt, at least for me. It leaves like, there's no, like, I don't, like, when I drink ayahuasca, I don't have any doubt whatsoever that I am connecting to this divine goddess intelligence. Like, it's not even a question for me. With mushrooms, it's the same thing. It's like,
Right.
I've never had a bad trip. And people's like, really? You've never had a bad trip? I'm like, no, no. Like, why? Like, because I don't have any doubt that the natural intelligence found in the mushroom, found in the sacred vine, well, technically in the chacruna leaf, but you know what I mean? Like, that comes from this divine source. I mean, when you drink ayahuasca, I mean, and she speaks to you, it's as obvious, it's as real as you and me speaking right now, Ed. Like,
Right.
and that's the
Yeah,
part
I've
that
never tried ayahuasca. I really want to though.
it's like, it's interesting for me because when like it's like I have atheist friends and they drink ayahuasca and it's like they get stuck in what I call the arcade, which is, have you ever done just regular DMT at all?
No, I've done acid and mushrooms, and I've done
Okay.
bad acid. I've had bad acid, but I've
Okay.
never had a bad mushrooms experience.
Gotcha. Yeah, me neither. I've never had a bad mushroom experience. In fact, I've the worst as far as bad trips are concerned with me, they've only happened on cannabis. Like when I took way too much like of a tincture that so because I make like a lot of my own tinctures and potions and elixirs out of
Right.
cannabis, psilocybin, henbane, mandrake, all these little witchy herbs and stuff. And once I was at a restaurant with my mom and my business partner, and I definitely took way too much of my tincture beforehand, and it was not pretty. Like they had to call like the ambulance and everything because I literally just passed out right there at the table, and wasn't really. I wouldn't even consider it a bad trip though. It just kind of sucked a little bit. But yeah, with
I have floored myself from overdosing on my own concoctions of weed too.
ah, oh my God. Okay, one of these days you and I got to get together and make some super
Uh,
recipe that just puts everyone on their ass.
oh my God, I'm a little leery of edibles for that reason, man. Like,
Yeah.
um,
Oh, I love
I mean,
the
the literature is full of people having bad experiences from overdosing on edibles. I mean, that
oh,
is
sure.
the literature is full of it going back for centuries because those are the stories that people write down. 1,000 people can have a nice, pleasant experience, but nobody bothers to write that down because it's not very interesting literature. But the guy who had like a completely psychotic break from overdosing on edibles in the mid 1800s, like he writes that shit down.
You know,
Um,
what's interesting, I think the oldest report we have of a bad trip comes from Plutarch. Plutarch writes, because he was a priest of the the mysteries of Delphi.
okay.
So with the oracles there, and so he writes. Oh, what book is this in? I forget. which one he wrote in, but I could send it to you if you're interested. But he wrote about how one of the oracles, like, you know, they sat over the crevice in the earth, and
And there was some gas coming
yeah, the
up, and
gas comes up, and it apparently was too much for this oracle, and she ended up flipping out and running out of the temple and screaming and writhing on the ground. It's like, I mean, Plutarch he's describing a bad trip.
right, totally,
It's
absolutely.
interesting, you know. It's like that's how far back people, and even somebody as trained as a Delphic oracle can still have a bad trip if it's too strong, you know. I don't know.
Yeah,
I thought
yeah,
that was pretty interesting. But
yeah,
you're
yeah.
right
No, absolutely.
about cats writing in the 1800s about like their bad experiences and stuff, and also their really good experiences. And that's why when like I consider, like, so let me ask you this: do you consider cannabis a psychedelic?
Yeah, I just think it's a more mild one, and that it's the advantage of cannabis is not obviously not as potent as like mushrooms and stuff, but the advantage of cannabis is you can do it every day. Whereas mushrooms, you know, you're not doing that like every single day. So you can like sort of live in that cannabis space like perpetually, like Shiva is perpetually stoned. Um, so you can kind of you can be perpetually stoned and be a functioning adult in this world.
Sure,
But you're not going
sure.
to be like dosing out on mushrooms 24/7.
Yeah, yeah. My friend Stephen Gray. Do you know Stephen Gray by any chance?
I know of him, but I don't know him personally.
He's a great guy. He's a hell of a dude. He refers to cannabis as the people's psychedelic, and I agree with him. I mean, the thing is, so one of the things about cannabis, why I think it's psychedelic, is that when we smoke cannabis, I don't care how big a joint or a blunt or a bong hit, you know, you take, you're still microdosing it. That's the thing. Cannabis is the only psychedelic that we microdose for a macro effect. So I say to people, okay, if you don't believe cannabis is psychedelic, eat 3 grams of hash and then
Right.
tell me it's not psychedelic. Like, no, but right? I mean, for real, have you ever had three? It's pretty fucking psychedelic, you know? It's just
Can't say I've ever eaten 3 grams of hash. Um,
I got, or it wasn't 3 gram, but it was like almost. It was like I was
right.
like, because I was going for it. I wanted to know like what the hell, and it wasn't pleasant. And had I moderated it a little more, it would have been a really beautiful psychedelic experience. The point is that I mean, it'll put you there. It'll get you to that psychedelic sort of or entheogenic space, however you know we want to call it. And I mean, when Osmond and Huxley, when Osmond originally coined the word psychedelic, the thing is, what I think a lot of people don't realize is that he would have considered cannabis a psychedelic. As you know, psychedelic just means mind manifesting.
Right, right.
And Osmond was actually trying to get away from clinical terms. So today it's interesting because chemists will say, oh, a psychedelic is anything, it has to interact with a 5-HT2A receptor. Fair enough. That's a perfectly fine definition, but that's not what Osmond had in mind when he coined the word. It was, and he was
And
literally
so
trying
what's
to
your
get.
so that opens a good question. Like, what is your take on the current state of like academic research on psychedelics and like
It's
the approach?
garbage.
Yeah,
It's
all right.
garbage. It's absolute garbage. In my forthcoming book, out June
Because
2025.
they're all atheist postmodernists.
What's that?
Because they're all atheist
Yes.
postmodernists.
Yeah. No. I mean, I show in my book just how really poor scholarship on in psychedelia is at this point. We have some very ridiculous ideas, like I'll just say, you know, one right off the top, and I'm saying this with complete respect towards different, like you know, the ayahuasca traditions in South America and some other traditions that weren't so misogynist, but like this idea that Westerners stole psychedelic psychotherapy from First Nations peoples is completely ridiculous. There was absolutely no such thing as psychedelic psychotherapy around First Nations peoples. That didn't exist. And you can't find it anywhere in the literature. And I've read it
So they
all.
weren't doing therapy. So what were they doing?
They were sacrificing people and then eating them. No,
The ayahuasca folks?
no, not the ayahuasca folks, the peyote folks.
Oh,
Yeah, the peyote folks. I mean, the Aztecs were, I mean, one of the most brutal civilizations out there. And in fact, it wasn't even quite, we like to pretend that Cortez took down Montezuma II? No, it wasn't Cortez. It wasn't his army. It was Cortez galvanizing all of the surrounding communities that the Aztecs were abusing. Cortez's great victory was not in fighting Montezuma by himself. His great victory was turning all the surrounding people against the Aztecs, because he's like, look, the Aztecs, they're going to keep kidnapping your people. They're going to keep raping your women. They're going to keep sacrificing you. They're going to keep eating you once they're done sacrificing you. They're going to eat your bodies. Or we can make a stand right now and get rid of them. And all the surrounding people like, well, yeah, fuck it. Like, I'm tired of these Aztecs coming and raiding my village, stealing my children, and then sacrificing them. In the final battles, I mean, the battles with Cortez against the Aztecs, the native warriors outnumbered the Spaniards by like 30-1, and in some battles 50-1.
I thought the Spaniards was like, I don't really know this much about that history, but I thought they had like very few men. It was like a dozen men in armor or something like that.
Yeah, they were. I mean,
maybe there was more than a dozen, but
yeah, no, they had a few hundred, maybe 500 or so. But I mean, against thousands from the Aztecs, it's like. But that's one of those things that people, I think, it's important for us to recognize that, like, it wasn't really Cortez who took down the Aztecs. It was all of the surrounding peoples who were sick of being abused by the Aztecs who actually took them out.
Yeah, no, it's important to recognize that indigenous people, that we shouldn't romanticize anybody really, that people are people, and that and there's wide diversity among people, and some of them are very admirable or have aspects that are admirable of their cultures and aspects that are not admirable about their cultures, and that
just
what's
like
going on in South America was a lot different than what's going on in North America, and in different parts of North America was very different.
I mean, look, while this was going on, I mean, Europeans were burning innocent women as witches. So there's plenty of,
awfulness.
It's plenty of horror to go around. I'm not saying this is to say that, the Spanish or the Europeans, they were so righteous, and the Aztecs, but no, everybody was an asshole. Everybody was self-centered, selfish. They wanted this, they wanted that, they wanted more gold, they wanted more resources, more women, more horses, more cavalry. Everybody was like that. And one of the things that I think, so far as, like, we were talking about this sort of spiritual renewal that we need, that I'd love to see happen, begins with the recognition that our ancestors had some really good ideas, and they also did some pretty terrible things, and that cuts across every civilization. It just does. I mean, if the Chinese had made it to the New World before the Europeans, they would have subjugated the people too. If the if the Aztecs had made it to Africa, they would have subjugated the people. That was the rule of the day. It was a domination culture, and all cultures were domination cultures in those days. And so what I'm hoping to do, at least with this book, is show people, look, why don't we use these lessons from the past, these horrors from the past, to be friendly to each other today? Let's be kind. Let's not do this again. But we'll see what happens.
I mean, I think this stuff ebbs and flows. And, my argument about the Bronze Age being like this decisive shift, and I already recognize this part of my argument is a little bit, the Aztecs is kind of pokes a bit of a hole in my argument, because the Aztecs didn't go through the Bronze Age. So obviously they could arrive at being nasty, patriarchal enslavers without the Bronze Age being a catalyst. So there's a lot of complexity.
But they still had writing. So maybe
they did have writing. You're right.
So maybe to that other point with that gentleman's book, like, where it's like it was the writing that started to make people treat women like shit. I mean, they still had. I got to read that book. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, there's a really great lecture. I'll send you the YouTube lecture that he has.
Please.
That you can watch in like an hour. Sums up the whole thing.
That'd be great.
It's really, you'll dig it, man. It's really fascinating. Man, there's so much we could talk about. Like, we could talk about Bible stuff or cannabis history. I'm like a real expert on like all aspects of cannabis history, both the fiber and the drugs, and right into the 20th century. I love talking about that stuff. Or we could talk about Bible stuff.
We could do Bible stuff. I don't know what kind of time limit you have, but I could do Bible stuff. Or, I mean, another thing I was going to say was, like, I don't know how you're feeling. I'm really enjoying talking to you, and I would
Yeah, no, I'm glad we hooked
hope
up.
that this isn't the last time we converse with each other. Because
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do as much podcasting as possible. But I'm actually really looking for like podcast partners to like do more. I'm done writing, to be honest with you. I'm like not doing any more writing. I've kind of retired from that, and I'm just like I've got my full-time job, keeps me pretty busy, but like I've got time for podcasting, and I want to do more talking about this stuff, in bigger groups too. But yeah, the cannabis of the Bible. So my whole shtick is that the first temple Israelites, the actual historical first temple that really was built, that really was there from 970 BC and was wiped out by the Babylonians in 580, whatever, 580. It was there for 400 years almost. And we know it existed and we know it was actually there. So the historical Israelites that lived there, in my argument, in fact, I mean, I'm totally certain this is true, were totally pagan all the way through, right until they went into exile in Babylon. They were still pagan.
Mhm.
They're fighting about all this stuff. Yahweh is a was a reform cult, and so they're having a reformation that's playing out over centuries, and they're fighting over a couple different things specifically. Initially, they're fighting. Initially, I think it's a cultural reform, and then later it becomes theological. But they're fighting about child sacrifice for sure,
Mhm.
which I believe was totally real, and
Oh
people
yeah,
really were sacrificing babies. And you had a group of reformers who came along and said, "Stop doing that! Stop sacrificing babies!" And people were like, "We've always sacrificed
yeah.
babies. The gods command to sacrifice babies. How
Like
dare you
what? How can
how
we
dare
not
you tell me
sacrifice
not to
baby?
sacrifice babies?" And so they're fighting about that, and that plays out over like generations and centuries even. The Greeks and Romans write about it too, with this exact same level of disgust that the Hebrew prophets write about it. They describe it in very similar terms. We know we have archaeology from Carthage that has direct connection because they're all Baal worshippers. They're all Phoenicians and Baal worshippers, so there's a direct connection to the Canaanites to Carthage. So I totally think that's real. But also, they're fighting about the goddesses. They're fighting to get rid of Asherah. I don't know how much you know Bible history, but like there's two goddesses that are mentioned,
Yeah,
Asherah and Astarte.
yeah. No,
Um, and Astarte is Aphrodite, she's Ishtar. And so she's the one that King Solomon is worshiping, who's the father of the wisdom traditions, who kicks off the whole idea of Sophia. My argument is that King Solomon is sort of where they get rid of the old stuff they didn't like by the goddess, but keep the stuff they do like, which is Sophia. And King Solomon is that conduit. Um, so there's two goddesses they mentioned, but there's actually a third goddess, which is Anat, who is the same as Kali.
mhm.
She's a death goddess.
The revenge goddess.
She goes with Baal. She's slathered in blood. She's a goddess of slaughter. But so we know she was there too, but they don't mention her because she's the most powerful one of all. And what they're doing is they chop down the Asherah pole. So the
Mhm.
Asherah is represented by this totem pole. So
Yeah,
they're
yeah,
chopping down the Asherah pole. They slut shame Astarte. They call her shameful Astarte, which is like literally slut shaming because she's a sex goddess.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But they don't even mention Anat because she's too powerful. Part of what they're doing is they're taking the names away. So in Genesis 1, you've got the waters. God creates the heaven and the earth, but then the Spirit of God hovers over the waters in the opening lines of Genesis. But the waters don't have a name. God did not create those waters. God emerged from those waters. But in all the neighboring cultures, that's the source goddess. That's Shakti. That's what the Hindus still call Shakti to this day. The chaotic waters at the dawn of creation, before it's put in order, has a name, and it's the mother, and that's the great salt waters. That's Shakti, but they're not. But they're taking her name away because that's a theological argument. It's an elaborate theological divorce. And so then Genesis 2, with the Garden of Eden story, is aimed squarely at the Asherah traditions. Eve represents Asherah and the Kadesha priestesses. So the priestesses are called the Kadesha,
Yeah.
which means the holy ones,
Mhm.
which gets translated as temple prostitutes. Which the modern scholars are like, oh, that's just a bunch of BS. Like, no, they actually were doing sex because, like, in these matriarchal cultures, they celebrated women's sexuality. They put women's sexuality on a pole. Like, Ishtar is totally slutty. Like, Ishtar is like a porn star by our standards. If you read the Mesopotamian literature about Ishtar, it's super, super sexual, super graphic, and she's a total, like, line up all 40 men in town, and I'm going to, have sex with all of them.
Inanna
And
too.
what's that?
Inanna too.
Yeah, yeah. And
With her
Anna and
silver
Ishtar.
vulva. Her favorite thing, the favorite creation was her own vagina.
Exactly. So Inanna becomes Ishtar.
Hmm.
becomes Astarte.
Hmm.
There's two different Aphrodites. So she's Aphrodite Urania, not the weaker Aphrodite Pandemos we're more accustomed to, but the fully figured Aphrodite Urania, then Venus for the Romans, and then she's Uzzah for the in the Quran, in the satanic verses, you get these same three goddesses, and that's Alat, who goes with Allah, Alat and Allah. She's the mother goddess. Mainat is the same as Anat, who's the same as Kali, and then Uzzah is the maiden, is the maiden, and then Durga is in modern day Hinduism. You still find a million Durga temples all over India today, and she's the most beloved one. She's the most popular one. And the key thing about these goddesses is that they're not submissive to the male gods. They
Hmm.
are not submissive in any of the stories. They're not submissive to their husbands. They're not submissive to their fathers. Respectful, perhaps, maybe, maybe not, but they're certainly not submissive. And that is key. And that exists to this day. Modern day descriptions of Durga are that she is not submissive to any males. This is really, really important because if you're trying to impose patriarchy and you've got a bunch of intransigent women that are like insisting on their independence, and they've got these goddesses that are showing them the example of how to be independent, you got to get rid of those goddesses.
Yeah.
And so they're trying to bring the women under control. And so they're having this reformation against their religious traditions that gave them wealth, gave them power in society. All this temple prostitution was run by women, and the women kept the money and they brought it back to their own matriarchal households. And there was no slut shaming anywhere in the story. It's like the girls keep the money for themselves, and
Well, yeah.
respectable women were involved in it.
Yeah, I mean, you don't really get slut shaming until essentially Christianity. I mean, that's, and in the Middle Ages with Mary Magdalene and what was it, Pope Gregory, just kind of being, I think it was Pope Gregory, if I'm not
He called
mistaken.
Mary Magdalene a prostitute.
Yeah, Mary Magdalene is a prostitute, but like, there's literally nothing in the New Testament that would indicate that she was.
I would actually, I'll take a little flyer on this point. They
Go for it.
describe Mary Magdalene in the Bible as having seven demons cast out of her. Nowhere in the Bible does it say she was a Jew. It says she has seven demons cast out of her. They're living in the Greco-Roman world, and all these mystery cults are still alive and well and all over the place. Everybody knows about them. Everybody knows about the Mother Goddess. Everybody knows about Isis, in that world. Um, and so I think that could be that the seven demons being cast out of her could be a reference to her having been engaged in the mystery traditions, the goddess traditions, and then deciding to go with Jesus. Because Jesus hangs out with women all the time, but I'm personally convinced that Jesus is totally chaste, he's totally celibate, and that part of the key to the whole Christianity is celibacy and chastity. And so the relationship between Mary Magdalene and Jesus is chaste. They're not having sex. I don't think they're married. I don't think they're secret children.
Yeah, me
I
neither.
don't think they have a sexual relationship. I think it's a chaste relationship. And I think that's important. And I think that this is an era of late paganism where the women are at this point frustrated because these mystery traditions have long since been taken away from them. They're now being run by men. There's no respectable women involved. It's just sex slaves involved at the temple. It's not respectable women keeping the money for themselves. It's sex slaves and their male pimps keeping the money. And so this is an era where the women are frustrated because they're expect a respectable married woman at the time of Jesus in the first century. She's expected to be monogamous and chaste, but her husband isn't. Her husband's still free to go down to the temple and do whatever he wants.
Hmm.
So Christianity brings in sexual ethics for men and starts telling married men to be monogamous to their wives when nobody else ever told married men to be monogamous to their wives. I think that's a big part of the reason why Christianity was popular with women, because it's
Oh,
starting to get
absolutely.
the men to engage in the same sexual behavior that the respectable women. Now, lower class women could still be prostitutes and everything, but respectable upper middle class married women, hell no. Hell no, you could not be engaged in any of that kind of stuff. Um,
Yeah, it appealed.
but now Christianity teaches their husbands to have the same rules.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. That Christianity appealed to women mostly. I mean, like in the Gospel of Mark, when the least shall be first. Well, who were the least in those days? Well, slaves. And what was one step above being a slave? Being a woman. You know.
Right.
So of course it appealed to them. And what's also interesting is that I mean, in those early days, women seem to very much have been in charge of like the house churches. And I mean,
In the earliest days, absolutely.
yeah, and the
Paul was
early, I
running
mean,
around
Paul
women, and so
writes
was
about
Jesus.
them. Paul writes about the women, like in oh, what in his letters, I forget which one specifically, but I mean, he talks about meeting all these different women. Juno's one of them. Um, And these are all the people that are in charge, and they're all women. And yeah,
And then I had another scholar describe to me is that you can see the cord being cut, like you can see them like cutting the microphone on the women and like breaking the hook and yanking them off the stage. And because like Paul did not write all the letters that are attributed to Paul, like he only wrote
yeah,
like half of them.
yeah. The
And so you
pastoral epistles
see the
are
ones, and so the ones where they say the women are not allowed to speak in church,
First
that's not
Timothy.
written by Paul. That's written
Yeah,
by somebody else.
yeah. That's First Timothy. First, Second
Exactly.
Timothy, Titus. Those weren't written by Paul. At least the scholarly consensus is they weren't. Colossians, I believe, is another one. So there's 13 letters. 7 are deemed authentic, obviously with some editing and interpolations in there because they
Right,
all
right.
have that. And then there's 6 of them that are considered not authentic, and those are the ones you're talking about. And that I had a
And
conversation
one of
with.
the key details, if you read it yourself, one of the key details that distinguishes them is how they refer to women.
Oh
And the
yeah,
ones that are not written by Paul are super misogynistic,
oh yeah,
and the ones
yeah.
that are written by Paul are like not misogynistic.
Yeah, that I mean, and that's why scholars sort of divvied them up that way between authentic and inauthentic. It has to do
And
with,
I'm sure there's other details too. There's
yeah.
probably other
Oh, of
details
course.
too, but
Well, there's linguistic clues. Like there's certain words that Paul wouldn't have used, or he means it a different way in a different letter. I mean, it's all, there's a lot there to it. But yeah, one of the main things is just with the pastoral epistles, how women are, sit down, be quiet. It's like that wasn't Paul's thing at all. I mean,
exactly.
it's either in Romans or First Corinthians where he talks about, these guys get to bring their wives around preaching with. They're like, why don't I get to? Why don't we get to do that too? And it's like he clearly didn't have a problem with women going around preaching at all. Like at least according to scholarly consensus as to what the authentic letters were. I had gotten into this with Chris Bennett years ago because he was talking about he was bringing up the misogyny of Paul, and he was only quoting the pastoral epistles. I'm like, dude, I love you, man. I love your reason, but Paul didn't write those. Like,
Right.
that's not it. And he's Bennett, so he argued back about it. I'm like, dude, like, people have known for centuries that Paul didn't. Like you got to update your browser, man. Like, nobody's believed for a very long time that Paul wrote those letters. But,
Right. And it's obviously the treatment of women is obviously a big dispute with the Gnostics too, because the Gnostics have got Mary Magdalene as the apostle to the apostles, and they talk all about Sophia and Divine Mother in the Gnostic texts. It like leaps off the page. She's
yeah,
all not the Divine Mother is all over the place in Gnostic texts, not as Mother Earth, but as Sophia.
that's Sophia.
Um, and so, um, one thing I've learned recently that is really, I think, super fascinating about early Christianity is the dispute not with the Gnostics, but the dispute with, do you know what was actually the most popular religion in ancient Rome? It was the religion of Isis, which had gone through the Alexandrian transition. So instead of being Isis, Horus, or Isis, Osiris, and Horus, which it was in the older Egypt, um, Osiris had been merged with Zeus and had become Serapis. So you got Isis and Serapis. Isis didn't change her name, but Osiris did. And then Horus changed his name to, I can't, Harpocrates. I forget what they changed Horus into. But Zeus and Osiris were merged, and that became Serapis. But Isis, they had gone around and systematically merged her with every other important goddess in all of the Mediterranean. And they
Yeah.
had systematically syncretized her with everybody. So
Mm-hmm.
with the Eleusinian mysteries of Demeter, so Isis and Demeter are merged together. Isis and Artemis are merged together. And so the Eleusinian mysteries get incorporated into the mysteries of Isis and gets turned into an export religion where it's exported all over the Roman Empire. They're worshiping Isis in London. The city of Paris was named for the Parisi, where pagan Gauls that worshipped Isis prior to Julius Caesar coming through or whatever. So Isis was worshipped all over, all 4 corners of the Roman Empire,
Sure.
and most of the Roman emperors were Isis worshippers. And so they have a trinity of mother, father, son. And so this is like who the Christians are arguing with. The Christians want a trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost with no mother goddess, but their rivals are Isis and mother, father, son. And so you see this real theological dispute over the Trinity and over the role of the Divine Mother in Christianity, because Jesus being a dying, rising God with the three Marys at his side at the resurrection is clearly drawing from these religions of the mother. And because resurrected gods were at the very heart of these traditions, all over the place, all these dying, rising gods. It's an argument I'm trying to get the academics to admit, because they won't admit this. They see that there's all these dying and rising gods all over the place, but they fail to recognize that it's all one big religion of the mother, cross-cultural, all over the place. And that's what the mother does. Is she's in charge of the cycle of life. And so she's in charge of these resurrection cycles. And so you've got Jesus as this resurrected God, is clearly drawing on these traditions. I mean, it's clearly influenced by Isis, who resurrects Osiris. All of these goddesses are resurrecting somebody. And so,
But wait, I'm just, and you definitely know more about Egyptian religion than I do, so you'll please correct me. But I thought that, so Isis, she brings the body parts of Osiris together, but that he remains in the underworld, like that he never actually comes, resurrects to the surface. And I'm not saying you're incorrect about
I mean,
the larger
there's
Isis
different
motif.
tweaks.
But
He's still a resurrected god.
yeah, it's kind of like with Inanna, where it's like she doesn't like, she dies in the underworld, but it's not like she is killed and then goes to the underworld. She walks into the underworld and then is killed by
Erishkigal, her sister.
Yeah, her sister.
And then she sends her husband back as her replacement, and he comes back around every year.
Yeah.
Well, because Dumuzi is the dying rising god.
He was a little too comfortable sitting on that throne of Inanna, man.
I know, right?
Little too comfortable. Yo, if I fucking died and had this whole, epic coming out of the underworld, and I came back here and I don't know, my lover was just kind of like, yeah, kind of took your place.
This is my point about.
A little bummed out too.
She's not submissive to her husband. She's
the
boss of her husband.
Yeah, she was like, oh, from the throne, yeah, you're getting in the underworld, motherfucker.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So so all these, I mean, there's different tweaks on all these stories. None of them are exactly the same as the other. But the point is, it's a resurrection cycle.
Yeah, they all pertain to their, they're all very highly localized. Like there's always there's differences, but they're sort of distinctions without a difference, for lack of a better way of putting it.
No,
like Mithra, for example, doesn't actually die, but he does undergo a passion, So it's like, well, that's sort of similar. Like, yeah, he doesn't die and rise again, but there's still that struggle to overcome whatever the thing is that now you can bestow upon your followers who will now be saved. I mean, they were all salvation cults.
Yeah, and Mithras is worshipped alongside Cybele, who's the great mother goddess. I mean, I learned that kind of recently. I haven't studied this very closely, but my understanding, and I could be corrected on this, is that Mithras goes with Cybele, and that she's the other great mother goddess of the Roman era. And her title is literally Magna Mater, Great Mother, and that's where we get the word material, and mother had that same root, that same Latin root of mater.
So what's really interesting is that, because I agree with you, the syncretism with Isis and all of the other goddesses surrounding the Mediterranean. What I still find interesting is that, so in the Bible, there's only one actual goddess mentioned, and it isn't Isis. It's Artemis.
Right. Well, Artemis was also very popular, in the New Testament. And that's that whole story about Paul going to the temple of Artemis, they don't say it in the Bible, but that temple was the biggest, grandest, most popular temple in the entire Mediterranean.
Yeah.
It was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. It was the biggest, most famous place, and Artemis was a really, really important goddess.
And that's why she made her way into the Bible, because she was that important. It's just, exactly. I guess what I find fascinating is that more goddesses don't show up. Or it could just be that for these early Christians, it was all bullshit. So we really, whether we're attacking Artemis or attacking Isis or attacking Venus, it doesn't matter, because it's all bullshit. So we just need to show that one of them is bullshit, and then the rest will fall. Maybe, I don't know.
I mean, that's a good point. I mean, well, part of the theology, and even back then, part of the theology was that all the goddesses are all one big super goddess. They're all refractions, like putting a light through a prism, it breaks up in all these different colors. All the goddesses are all drawn from the same source, which is why they have very fluid identities.
Yeah, exactly.
It's actually very tricky to study goddesses, this flummoxed me for a long time. They're like always very fluid, like their names and their
Yep,
symbols are always like switching around, and it's like which
100%.
one is which? And then I learned relatively recently, and this is modern Hindu theology, is that they're all one super goddess. And that's how you get to Mother of God as a theological concept, that there really is a Mother of God, and it's all of the goddesses all together, all like Voltron, all become one super goddess. If you catch my Voltron reference there,
Yeah,
it's
I did. I
all
loved it.
one. It's all one goddess, and the Hindus call it Shakti, and in the Roman era they were calling her Isis, but it's all one super goddess that is the mother of the biblical God.
Yeah, and what's interesting, do you know about the Isis sculpture in Benevento, Italy? Like that's
Maybe.
how far down. No, it's in because just going sort of piggybacking off what you were saying about just how widespread ISIS actually was, that even in this was after like after the Christian era, around I think 500 of the Common Era or so like 500 years so after the alleged life of Jesus. But they built this obelisk in Benevento, Italy, and dedicated it to Isis. Like, and this is well within the Christian era.
Yeah,
Like,
she was the
that's how
last goddess
popular she
standing.
was.
Isis was the last of the major goddesses that they still had temples to. The last goddess temples to be shut down were Isis temples.
Yeah, that's it's really, even after were they later than the Telesterion, where they held the rites of Eleusis? Because that I'm not sure. I'm sincerely asking. I'm not sure. Um, but either way, I mean, it's just the destruction of all that knowledge and all that tradition. It just, I like, why do people got to be such dicks to each other? Like, I don't get it. It's like, yeah, we lose so much with that. Um, but yeah, oh, what was I about to say with that? Yeah, just how widespread ISIS actually was, and maybe that's one of the reasons that the Christians like completely ignored her, was just to be
She was
like,
definitely their biggest rival. She
yeah,
was
and but
definitely the
that's
biggest
what's so
rival. So
weird.
you're trying not to draw attention to her, right?
Yeah,
And if
and
you are going to draw
also,
attention, it's going to be to denigrate it.
yeah, Mithra was also a pretty big rival, and not mentioned at all anywhere in the New Testament,
Right.
um, or in any of the other, the apocryphal literature. Like, you just don't see it anywhere, which I've always been fascinated by that. It would be
Because
like
because
writing a,
because no, I'll tell you why, or why I think,
please,
because to name it is to empower it, and part of the
fair enough.
theological argument is to take the names away.
Yeah,
By not naming something, it doesn't exist. Like this is
sort
a
of.
theological concept. Adam gives the names to the animals and stuff in Genesis, but by taking names away, it's equally powerful. You make things not exist. So you don't want to mention these goddesses. That's why they don't mention Anat in the Old Testament, because she's more powerful than God. She has the power to destroy God's creation.
Yeah,
You can't even insult her. You can't even insult her. You just have to ignore her, and pretend she's not there.
yeah,
Because they insult Astarte and they insult Asherah, but they don't mention Anat.
yeah. It's like a reverse abracadabra spell. It's like,
Exactly.
if I do not speak it, therefore I destroy it.
Exactly. It's
I
exactly.
unmanifest it.
So, all right, here's a separate related question. So, you know how in the Septuagint, so back to cannabis,
Mm-hmm.
cannabis is mentioned 5 times, but the first mistranslation is in the Septuagint.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it's been mistranslated all along. The question is, and it's an open question, was that mistranslation accidental or intentional?
I think
I
accidental.
think it could be intentional, that they're trying to draw attention away from the cannabis. The cannabis was controversial back then too.
Yeah, but what, like, I would disagree with that, because like we would see, like, there weren't drug laws in those days. There was no such thing as that. Like, we today might sort of think that because we live in a prohibitive time with drugs, but that didn't exist in the ancient world. Like,
But it
there,
was part of the rival traditions, and cannabis was being burned in these goddess temples as part of their rival traditions, and so they're trying not to draw attention to it. They want to get rid of it. They want to at least get rid of it out of their own
not out of the
culture.
Temple of Arad.
That
The
was way
like,
that was way before the Septuagint. That was centuries before.
okay, I didn't know. I don't know when the Temple of Arad was built.
Temple of Rod was knocked down in like 600 or 700 BC
Gotcha. Okay. Then
in the
never mind.
first temple. That's the first
Got,
temple time period.
gotcha. Okay.
And the Septuagint is like 300 BC. It's like a couple hundred years later.
Yeah. One of my old when I worked at Queens College in research, one of my mentors said, "Always just be mindful of the mistranslations." And it's like, sure, but in some cases, it's really obvious that there's a mistranslation here, you know. And I think that with cannabis and calamus, it is so. I think it's so obvious that whether it was intentional or not, this is a mistranslation of cannabis. Like
Yeah,
without
calamus does not fit the context.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. Like it's like there's the etymological argument, and then there's the fact that if you put calamus, yeah, in these passages, it doesn't actually work.
Right.
Especially Song of Songs. You are not growing calamus in a garden. Doesn't work that
We're
way.
burning it in the temple. It's not.
Yeah, we're burning it in the temple. Like it's, I don't know. Whereas, I mean, have you ever burned calamus? Does it have a sweet aroma to it? I don't know.
I don't know that I've ever even seen calamus in my life.
I mean, I know that cannabis does. I love the smell of burning cannabis.
Cannabis is very potent. They could, one of the translations is aromatic cane, which is in fact
exactly.
a perfect translation of cannabis.
Yeah, I know, right? Exactly. And it's like, well, that's what I'm wondering, like, because I've never burned calamus. Like, does it have is it an aromatic cane as well? Again, even if it were, though, even if it were, all of the evidence still points to cannabis being cannabis. I mean, the conservative argument against cannabis being cannabis pretty much boils down to, well, I don't like it.
Exactly.
I don't like that. That's what it means.
I don't like that idea. And
yeah, I like that's it though. But that is the best argument I've heard. Is well, I don't like that, and look at my diplomas and look at my degrees, and I don't like it. So it's like, well, then give me something to work with. Like, why? Like, somebody needs to explain to me how canna or cannabism is not etymologically linked to cannabis, kunabu, kanba.
Do you know Dan McClellan? Do you know he's a YouTube?
I know the name.
Bible guy.
I know
he does a ton of YouTube. Bible, like he's a Bible scholar. And he did that. He did a clip on exactly the cannibalism and totally shot it down. He totally said, "I don't think it's true."
You got to send this to me, man. I got to check that out.
And I thought it was. He generally does. Actually, he's really no. He's a good scholar for what he does, but he's like a postmodernist Mormon. He's kind of weird.
A postmodernist Mormon?
Yeah, he's an academic, but he's also
what a time to be alive. I didn't even think that was a thing that could exist. But then again, we have postmodern atheists, and I didn't think that could exist.
Yeah, he totally did a bad faith. Chris Bennett and I were totally trying so hard to get him to engage with us on this cannabis discussion. He just would not bite. Chris was writing him letters. Chris talked to him, and McClellan just would not bite. And then he finally did one of his little 5-minute videos on cannibalism. Said, "Well, I don't like it." He said exactly what you said. He said, "I see this etymological argument, but I don't like it, and I don't admit it, and that's into that. And I'm the academic, and you got to listen to me."
Yeah,
he didn't.
I didn't even know that
context. He didn't engage that it was 5 verses instead of just the one. He only looked at just the one Exodus version of the holy anointing oil, and he didn't engage with the context of it. He did not engage with actually if you make that recipe and like with calamus. Calamus is super toxic. Like it's illegal to be used in foods in Europe because it's so toxic. All right, let's have one more topic, and then before we get too late, have you heard my whole shtick with Jesus and the resurrection and cannabis?
Go for it.
So Chris Bennett, I got this originally from Chris Bennett, and then I expanded on it. The argument is swoon theory. Are you familiar with swoon theory? The idea that Jesus simply survived the crucifixion and that he didn't actually die. It's been around forever. People have been saying this for centuries. Since day one, people have believed in swoon theory. That's what the Muslims believe. I happen to believe it too. If there was a real Jesus and if there really was a crucifixion, that the guy simply survived. So Chris Bennett learned this argument from somebody else, but when Jesus is on the cross, immediately before he succumbs, he's given this mystery potion, the wine vinegar. And nobody knows what the wine vinegar is. Like, why would you give this guy wine vinegar what even is wine vinegar. I remember as a kid in church being like, what the heck is wine vinegar? And why would he even want it? But it's in three of the Gospels. Three of the four Gospels have this detail of Jesus being given the wine vinegar. So it's obviously an important detail. People speculated that it was a drug and it's narcotic and it's knocking him out, making
Yeah,
him
the
appear
Passover
dead.
plot. Yeah.
Exactly. Cannabis. No, it's the Passover plot. Yeah, that's the original book. So Chris took that book and said, you know what? I bet that's cannabis because cannabis would actually work in that context. That a very super potent tincture of cannabis actually would knock you out and make you look like you're dead. And Chris has got all this different evidence for it being done in India with sadhus and faking their death and everything. And there's medical evidence of like experiments on dogs in the 19th century where they were trying to kill the dog to establish the fatal. There's a pharmaceutical test trying to establish the fatal death limits for cannabis, and they never succeeded in killing a dog. They would give these dogs massive overdoses, grams and grams of hash, injections into the jugular vein. They did it repeatedly. Never once killed the dog. They'd knock the dog out for like 2 or 3 days, and then the dog would wake up and be just fine.
Well, there's a major because I've looked into this myself. I was going to write about that whole thing, like the Passover plot idea. There's a major, major monkey wrench in the whole thing.
All right, what's that?
If Jesus, presuming he lived, and I don't know if he did or not, but let's just presume that there was a historical Jesus who was crucified historically. If he had been given some kind of drug, cannabis or otherwise, the only thing that would have done was sped up his death. Because crucifixion, you're killed from asphyxiation. That's how you die. The torture of it is the fact that you're like this and you have to keep lifting yourself up to stay alive. If he had been drugged and knocked out and put into like a death-like state, he would not have been able to get air into his lungs and he would have asphyxiated. It's
Except they
just,
took him down off the cross.
what's
That's
that?
the whole point. He wasn't on the cross for very long. Crucifixions normally take days. They're slow, agonizing death. And Jesus is only on the cross for a couple hours. They give him
What
the drug,
about
they knock
this?
him out, and they take him down.
What about the spear of Longinus,
What is, I don't know what that is.
where Longinus is the Roman soldier who, after Jesus is presumed dead, takes his spear and sticks it right into him.
That's
And
definitely in John. The spearing is definitely in John. That's the latest of the Gospels and the most literary of all of them. I mean, all four Gospels have Jesus being brought down off the cross after just a couple hours. They all have him being when crucifixions normally take days, and so and then
but what I'm saying is that couple of hours wouldn't have mattered if he actually took a drug because he would have died faster. Like if he had been given a drug, even if Jesus had been given a drug, like a cannabis drug, or I've heard mandrake as well as a possibility to knock him out, had that been the case, then within an hour of being knocked out, he would have been dead because you cannot survive on a cross without, like, you will asphyxiate very quickly. So even if it was only a few hours, it doesn't, he would have been dead. He would have been dead in like 10 minutes or so. Like it's that's how fast you will die if you can't hold yourself up on a cross. It's fast. They did this. They've done studies on this in what's his name? Gary Habermas. And I'm not a big fan of his. He's a little too much on the apologetic side, but he does know his shit. And he was talking about in Mexico, they actually did tests about this with actually crucifying people. Like, and
and
obviously
drugging them,
stopping the
they're like testing the drug theory.
to test how long it actually takes to kill a person and how they actually die. It didn't have to do with the drug theory, but what they did demonstrate is that if you cannot hold yourself up for like on that, you are going to die very, I mean, think about it. How long does it take to die from asphyxiation? A minute or
No,
two?
no, I hear what you're saying. I do hear what you're saying. I mean, asphyxiation is how people die on the cross. My only point is that even the Gospels attest to this. That normally crucifixions take days, and Pontius Pilate was very surprised when they wanted to take him down very quickly.
Sure.
And then he just dies a couple weeks later. It's like, and then he's sent to heaven 30 days later. I'm not suggesting the guy lived for very long. Obviously, he was badly injured, and it was all a very dramatic event. And even the Gospels say he did die. Like he's sent to heaven after so many days. So I just think he survived long enough for some people to see him. And the wine vinegar is there as a mystery potion. That's a detail that needs to be accounted for. Like, why? What are they? What's the wine vinegar? Like, what is
Yeah,
it?
no, I agree with you because you're 100% right about that. Like nobody, you're a writer, I'm a writer. No writer puts something in their book accidentally.
Right.
That just there's no every sentence you wrote in the history of the goddess had intention. You had a reason for that sentence to be there.
Yeah,
Every
absolutely.
sentence I've ever written, every sentence Chris Bennett, P.D. New, any writer in all of human history, nothing appears accidentally. So I agree with you, Ed, that there is a reason the whole like gall and vinegar or wine and vinegar, however that we translate it, it's there for a reason without a doubt. The reason of it, I don't personally know. I mean, some people say that it was to just sort of moisturize his lips so that he doesn't have dry mouth. Which I guess you know what, if he had cannabis, he probably had some cotton mouth, and so they gave him the wine. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I don't. I've only recently started to actually doubt the historicity of Jesus. I've been a historicist for the past several, like I would say last 10, 15 years of my adult life. I recently read Richard Carrier's book. And I got to be honest, that dude makes one of the most compelling arguments for the non-existence of Jesus. In fact, he has created the only argument I've ever read where I was like, oh my God, Jesus might not have existed at all. Like, and this is all very new. I'm talking like this is like a month old for me that I
Right.
started
No,
reading.
I'm super familiar with Richard Carrier. I'm not a big fan. He's a postmodernist atheist. I mean, he's a scholar. He's a serious scholar. He puts a lot of detail into his work, and I'm not disputing that. Um, uh, but I find it, I don't know, I'm not a big fan of his.
Yeah,
But yeah, I mean, yeah, him and Robert Price also has like a really strong, mysticist argument. I haven't found it super persuasive. I still think that there was probably a guy, and that guy, there was a man named Jesus, and there's a God named Jesus, and somehow the man was turned into a god. My position is the women did it, and the women were not merely witnesses of the resurrection; the women were fully responsible for it, and that the three Marys are central to the story.
yeah, actually,
And
you know, the three Marys are one of the reasons. I have this weird way of doing exegesis, like as far as like whether the stories in the Bible are true or not. And one of the reasons that I thought they were true, again, has to do with just being a writer. You know, three women named Mary in the same story is just really bad writing. Like that's awful writing,
unless it's symbolically important.
unless there really were three women that happen to be named Mary. You know, that for me, it's like, well, why would you? It's just like, again, it's like, who would do that? Like, who would put three people with the same name in such a short amount, you know, a very short story? It's like, unless their names were actually, you know, Mary of Bethany, Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, you know, like, so that's one of the reasons I always thought it could be accurate or that there was something to the Bible stories, but I
I
don't
mean,
know.
that's long been one of the arguments is that like, why would you have the women were considered unreliable witnesses? So why
Yeah,
would you have the women be there
that's
if there
another one.
wasn't, to your point, why
So
wouldn't the women be there if there was some truth to it?
So
Uh,
I think that that's a case in favor as well. Now, somebody like Richard Carrier would say that, oh, it's because it's the reversal of expectations. It's again the least being first. Like the women were the least, now they're first. I'm like, well, if that were the case, then it should have been slaves who discovered Jesus because truly they were the least. Yeah, women were treated like absolute dog shit, second class citizens, highly patriarchal, but still they weren't the least. The slaves would have been the least. And
right,
Mary Magdalene was a wealthy woman. Like she wasn't the least. I mean, she was very wealthy. That's how she was able to fund Jesus's missionary endeavors. She was a rich woman. That to me doesn't like, yeah, it's low on the totem pole, but it's not the least. Least
right,
would be slaves or lepers, really.
right, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and it makes you wonder, like, what was Jesus talking about with all these women? Like, we don't really know. He was
No.
hanging out with women quite a bit.
Yeah.
Was he teaching them or was he learning something from them? Like, what was going on there?
Could be both. You know, that's a really great question. I'd like, yeah, I mean, maybe they were teaching him some of the sacred feminine secrets of the sacred feminine for all we know.
All these tricks of how to fake his death.
Oh, could be. Yeah, very much could be. Yeah.
Because those women that were in charge of all that, making potions and stuff and doing drugs, like that was women's business.
Yeah, I mean, it was men's business. I mean, the magicians were doing that too. I mean, the magi were definitely mixing their own potions as well. But yeah, it was a lot. We got to do this again, man, because
Yeah.
I would love to make this a regular thing with you, like, because this was awesome.
Yeah, sure. No, I'd be happy to talk about it. I've got lots to talk about. And um, yeah, for me, like, you asked me my religious perspective. For me, like it really is as like an environmentalist and bringing this stuff back to like how do we like restore our relationship to planet Earth and cycle of life today? Because industrial civilization is in trouble right now. We're going through a real crisis ecologically, and I think it's fixable. I'm totally an optimist. I totally think like our environmental problems are totally fixable with the right level of awareness guiding us. And we're not being guided by proper awareness or good leadership or wisdom, which is why we need to put Sophia back
Yeah, no, I
uh,
agree. We
to
have a
get some
lot of
wisdom.
knowledge these days, not so much wisdom.
Exactly. Lots of cleverness, not a lot of wisdom.
Yeah, no, totally.
It's like religious traditionalists, aren't really keen on it that much. Like Christians say I'm dangerous. The atheists think I'm weird.
Yeah,
The
me too.
academics don't want to talk to me because I'm making theological arguments that they don't want to hear. They're not open to these conversations about the goddesses. Like ever since Maria Gimbutas died, for the last 30 years, they've been shutting these conversations down, man. They don't want to admit that there's a goddess or a goddess tradition or even such a concept. They don't want to talk about it.
Well, it's their loss. I mean, I'm going to be working very hard over these next few years to demonstrate that after my book comes out.
What's your book about?
So it's called Psychedelic Injustice: How Identity Politics Poisons the Psychedelic Renaissance. And it's just, I'm just busting a lot of myths in the book that I think are going to be very difficult for people to swallow because they're myths that we all take for granted. Um, so I don't want to give too much away, but let's just say that indigenous psychedelic traditions were not did not involve sitting around a fire singing "Kumbaya," but were actually pretty goddamn grotesque and horrific.
Well, I'm also like Mexicans hated marijuana. Like
Oh yeah,
marijuana came to North with a sinister reputation. Mexican
yep.
Catholics hated marijuana
I have a whole
going back to the
chapter on it.
1700s.
Yep.
And conservative blacks, conservative Hispanics, they all hated marijuana. It's not like Martin Luther King was up there being like, "Hey, free the doobies," like
Yeah, I know,
we
right?
all hated marijuana. Like
Yep.
everybody hated marijuana. Like
Yep.
and so there was racism in law enforcement. Anslinger was really racist, racist against jazz musicians, all that stuff. But like,
See,
that was not the origins of it.
we'll have a big talk about if Harry Anslinger actually was racist towards jazz musicians because
Dude,
I
he's an
have a
old
whole chapter
school
on him.
segregationist, man.
What's
He's an
that?
old school segregationist.
Well, sorry, I missed
I'm
that.
saying Anslinger was an old school segregationist, an old George Wallace level segregationist. He
Yeah.
hated jazz musicians.
So I mean, so the only quotes that I found that talk about jazz musicians from Harry Anslinger are all made up things that he never actually said. Um,
There is a lot of fake quotes out there for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, I've gone through his papers, I've gone through his gore file, and there is literally nothing racist about any of it. In fact, what I show in my book, and I'm pretty sure I demonstrate this rather conclusively, Harry Anslinger actually went out of his way to avoid talking about race in all of his public statements. He never actually brings up race once. Never. And I've read all this, like it never comes up. It just doesn't. And in fact, in some cases where there were news reports where they mentioned the race of a perpetrator, if that perpetrator was Black American or Mexican, he wouldn't say that. And like he would read the story publicly, and instead of saying Black American or Mexican, just say a young man. Like he would literally go out of his way to not racialize the issue. So there's a lot about that guy that has been very unfairly cast on his memory. I don't like him as a person. He absolutely lied about cannabis. A lot of people are still suffering today because of how full of shit he was. But when it comes to this idea that he was this uncompromising racist, Dude, you cannot find that anywhere in the historical record. It's nowhere. And in fact, what you find is the opposite.
I'll push back on that some. The
Okay.
I do think he was careful in what he said. As you know, he was a very public figure for a very long time, and he worked at the United Nations.
Yep.
He was a very leading guy, and so he was. He is an interestingly paradoxical guy because, like, by all accounts, he was super not corrupt. Like, he was incorruptible in his personal life and lived a very modest life. He was very like Puritan. Like, I think he was a Lutheran. He was super religious, right? Um, but I do believe he did genuinely hate jazz music, and that and he did set up the jazz. I mean, he treated Billie Holiday terribly, and that
That was
as
her
far as like
husband, though.
hiring
That was her
people,
husband. He can't be blamed for that. It was her husband who actually set
it
her
was the
up.
Federal Bureau of Narcotics that ran her down for years. It was her. It was his agency.
Sure, but that was, yeah. We'll get into that next time we talk. There's a
And
little
then
bit
I'll
more to
make my
the
last point
story.
was that, like, in terms of his hiring practices, that like he didn't hire any black agents for upper ranks in the agency. The black agents were only allowed to work the street level stuff, but the upstairs guys that were management, all white. And that he was very intentional about that, and that it was like just old school Jim Crow level. But I don't disagree with you that, like, in his public statements he was pretty careful, and in fact he never brought up the Gore file once Prohibition got passed. He like put the kibosh on that altogether.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
literally, like the day the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, he never brought up the Gore file again in
yeah.
public.
Anslinger was racist. People are correct about that. The thing is, what they don't realize is who he was actually racist against. Everybody says it was Black Americans and Mexican Americans. That's what you'll hear all over the place. Every single person who says that has not looked into Harry Anslinger whatsoever, because there was a group that he absolutely hated on
The
a
Italian
racist.
mafia.
What's that?
The Italian mafia.
The Italians, exactly, Ed. He hated Italians. Just saying, like, there's
What did he say about jazz music? Because he did set up all the jazz. I mean, that's not hearsay that he was setting up the jazz musicians
he
for
has
harassment and bus.
he only makes reference to, and he actually doesn't even say jazz musicians. He makes one reference to musicians in his writings that I'm aware of. It had to do with so there were three different conferences that took place to make cannabis illegal. There was the conference on cannabis sativa. No, first there was the House Ways and Means Committee, then the conference on cannabis sativa lin, and then the debate of the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. And wait, what did you just say? Sorry, I got a little lost in my brain.
The jazz musicians.
Yes. So he only says he talks about musicians bringing cannabis up from Louisiana to Chicago. Now we can say that he's talking about jazz music. That's what he means when he's talking about New Orleans musicians. He means
Right.
jazz music, but he doesn't say anything denigrating. All he says is that the musicians brought it up north. That's it. He doesn't say because they're pieces of shit. He doesn't say because they're trying to ruin the world. He just says, oh, it was the musicians that brought it to Chicago. That is the only statement he ever made about jazz musicians. That's it.
I'll have to pull up these books I've read about him. It's been a while since I've read that stuff. But the one thing that I will always hold against Anslinger was that, America, also another thing people don't realize is that marijuana prohibition did not start in the United States. America was actually late to the game.
Yes.
By 1937, most of the world had already outlawed marijuana, and we were actually coming on it late. And he got pressured into it. He didn't really care about marijuana all that much.
No,
he
he
care
didn't.
about opium.
He
It was
didn't
all
give a
about
shit.
opium.
Yes, exactly. He didn't care
Um,
about that at all.
But the oh yeah, what I was going to say was that Anslinger was quite unique in global prohibition to conflate marijuana and fiber hemp, and to not distinguish between the fiber hemp that was growing wild all over the country and the drug types. Because in the rest of the world, in the Soviet Union and China and all these places that were even more harsh on drugs than we were, they kept growing fiber hemp. They did not have a problem distinguishing fiber hemp from drug types. They were growing fields of hemp all the way through Soviet history. They never stopped. They didn't have any drug problems with it. But Anslinger was like, oh, no, it's all the same plant. We're going to outlaw the wild weed. And that was very empowering to law enforcement to make the wild weed, which is grown as wild as dandelions,
Yeah, yeah.
to make to put law enforcement in charge of dandelions effectively was very empowering to law enforcement and to like make this wild weed because like marijuana doesn't really grow wild in the United States. And so all of these, you see photographs of big drug busts from the 1950s and stuff. It's always ditchweed, man. All
Oh
those
yeah,
old pictures, it's always ditchweed.
yeah.
Like 100% of the time, it's like always ditchweed until you get to like the 1980s. It's always ditchweed. But the rest of the world didn't make the ditchweed illegal. Only America did, and that was that was Anslinger's contribution, part of
Well,
his contribution.
his what's interesting when you read the minutes of the different conferences about this was how little Anslinger actually opens his mouth at all. Like he almost doesn't say anything
Right, right, yeah.
throughout all of these. And to your point, most of these debates, these conferences on cannabis, they were debates about that differentiation you just made between the drug type and like the industrial type, the hemp. And you had all of these different guys in Washington saying, Anslinger, you don't know what you're talking. Like all of our industry is going to go under if you make the plant illegal across the board. We can't do that. Like, look at all of these different things that are made from hemp. And Anslinger,
And the reason why they got rid of it, and the reason why they got away with it, is because hemp by that point had already gone out of style and was not a profitable business in the United States. We imported huge amounts of hemp. All the high quality hemp was all imported. We didn't
yeah, I
grow the
mean,
high
well,
quality stuff here.
and it's all like he again. We're gonna have a whole conversation about Harry, like all of this. This is because now we're getting into a whole
I
thing.
know,
We
right?
could do a few hours on this, and if that's cool with you, I'd love to say
I
it.
love hemp history, man. I love talking about hemp history. I think
Okay,
it's
well
fascinating.
then we're gonna set up a date again
All
because
right.
I enjoyed this way too much, man. And I want to thank you so much, Ed Dodge. For those out there still listening, please check out Ed's book, The History of the Goddess. There it is on screen right now, from the Ice Age to the Bible. Yeah, let's speak again, Ed. Like
All
soon.
right. Thanks, Todd. Great. Enjoy talking to you.
Peace out, brother.
See ya.